Charles saw William's signature at the bottom of the document and immediately reached for the paper. But Edward got there first. He placed one hand over the final page, looked directly at his brother, then said the sentence nobody in that room was prepared to hear. "You don't have the authority to stop him." Charles froze. Across the table, William held a small brass key that had once hung from Queen Elizabeth's private writing desk. Anne stood beside the window, completely silent. 3 palace lawyers refused to make eye contact with the king. Then Charles noticed the date typed above William's signature. The transfer had already taken effect. Not tomorrow. Not after another meeting. 47 minutes earlier. Charles pushed his chair back so sharply that it struck the wall. "You took my mother's estate?" William didn't move. He didn't apologize. He simply turned the key over in his palm and said, "No, I stopped you from giving it away." That should have ended the argument. Instead, Charles broke down. Because the estate wasn't the real secret hidden inside those papers. The real secret was what Queen Elizabeth had written about her eldest son before she died. And only one person in the room had read the entire letter. Edward. 2 days earlier, the Black Dispatch case arrived at Windsor Castle without warning. No royal crest, no palace courier, just a scratched leather box carried by a retired solicitor named Jonathan Halden, a man who had handled Queen Elizabeth's private affairs for nearly 26 years. He refused to hand it to Charles's equerry. He refused to leave it with the private secretary. He wouldn't even allow palace security to scan it outside his sight. "The instructions are specific," Halden said. "It must be opened in the presence of the king's 3 siblings and the Prince of Wales." That was the first problem. The second was the metal plate beneath the handle. It contained 5 engraved words. Personal property, not crown property. Charles read them twice, then a third time. The distinction looked harmless, but it wasn't. Crown property passed with the institution. Private property could be controlled by wills, trusts, contracts, conditions, handwritten instructions, and legal traps laid decades before anyone knew they would matter. Inside the case were 3 sealed envelopes, 1 inventory book, and a map of an estate called Gray Friars. Most people had never heard of it. That was intentional. Gray Friars sat behind Woodland in Norfolk, less than an hour from Sandringham. 3,200 acres, 14 tenant cottages, a private chapel, 2 lakes, a stable block, an archive building disguised as an abandoned stone barn. The late Queen had acquired the estate privately in 1976 through a family holding company. No public ceremonies, no official photographs, no palace announcements. Even some senior courtiers believed the land was merely part of Sandringham. It wasn't. Gray Friars belonged to Elizabeth Windsor personally, but Charles had spent the previous 3 months acting as though it now belonged entirely to him. That was the mistake. The first envelope contained a deed drafted in 1994. The second held an amendment signed 6 weeks after Princess Diana's death. But the third envelope was addressed to William, not Charles. Not the sovereign, William. Charles saw the handwriting and immediately reached for it. Halden pulled the envelope back. "This one is only to be opened if the continuity clause has been triggered." Nobody spoke. William glanced at Edward. Anne narrowed her eyes. Charles looked irritated rather than worried, because he still believed the meeting was a formality. Then Halden opened the inventory book and asked one question. "Has any attempt been made to transfer Gray Friars into a new family trust?" The room changed. Not dramatically. That was what made it worse. One secretary stopped writing. A lawyer slowly closed his folder. Camilla, who had been seated beside Charles, looked toward the door as though she suddenly wanted to leave, without appearing to leave. Charles answered carefully. A restructuring proposal was prepared. Prepared? That was the word he chose. But Halden didn't ask whether it had been prepared. He asked whether Charles had approved it. The king hesitated for 4 seconds. William noticed. Anne noticed. Edward noticed. Then Charles said, "I authorized preliminary documents." Halden turned to the palace lawyer. "Who were the proposed beneficiaries?" No answer. Charles interrupted. "That is a private matter." Halden's face remained perfectly calm. "So is Gray Friars." There it was, the first tiny crack. Because the proposed trust didn't preserve the estate solely for the sovereign's direct heirs. It created rights of residence for members of Charles's blended family. It gave future trustees the power to lease sections of the land. It allowed the main house to be used by people outside Queen Elizabeth's direct line of descent. Nothing had been sold. Nothing had been stolen. But one signature had changed the future of the property. Charles had signed it 6 days earlier. And the moment his pen touched that page, a clause written 32 years ago woke up. Halden opened the 1994 deed. The legal language was dense, but the effect was brutal. If any monarch attempted to sell, divide, mortgage, or redirect the estate beyond Elizabeth's named family line, control would automatically pass to the serving Prince of Wales, William. Charles stared at the page. Then he laughed. Not because it was funny, because he didn't believe it. My mother would never have placed her heir beneath his own son. Anne finally spoke. She didn't. Charles turned toward her. Anne pointed at the deed. She placed the estate beyond all of us. Wait, what? William wasn't being handed Gray Friars because Elizabeth trusted him more than Charles. He was being appointed its protector because the Queen trusted nobody with unchecked control. Not Charles, not William, not even the monarch who came after them. But there was another condition. William could activate the clause only after one of Elizabeth's other children confirmed that a prohibited transfer had been attempted. Andrew had not been summoned. Anne had refused to make the determination without seeing every document. That left Edward, the quiet brother, the one people ignored, the one who had spent years listening while everyone else fought over titles, money, homes, and proximity to the throne. Edward held the final say. And Charles knew it. The meeting ended without a decision, but nobody left feeling relieved. Because Edward asked Halden for copies of the proposed trust. Then he took them home. For 24 hours, the palace heard nothing. No statement, no phone call, no indication of which side Edward would choose. Charles tried to reach him 3 times. The first call went unanswered. The second was returned by an aide. The third reached Edward directly. Nobody knows every word spoken during that conversation in this dramatized account, but the exchange ended badly. Charles insisted the trust was designed to keep the family united. Edward asked why William had not been informed. Charles said William would have objected before understanding it. Edward replied, "Then you knew it required his consent." Charles hung up. But the worst part wasn't that Edward had challenged him. The worst part was that Edward had already found something hidden on page 17, a handwritten change. 4 words added beside the beneficiary list. At the king's discretion. Those 4 words meant future occupants could be selected by Charles alone. Not Parliament, not the trustees, not William, Charles. The palace lawyers called it flexibility. Edward called it exactly what it was, a loophole. By breakfast the next morning, William knew. He arrived at Windsor, carrying no entourage, no briefing folder, and no visible anger. That frightened Charles more than shouting would have. William walked into the private library, placed a copy of the trust on the table, then opened directly to page 17. Remove this clause. Charles didn't look down. No. William waited. Charles folded his hands. The monarchy cannot be run through threats from an heir who hasn't yet inherited its burdens. That landed. For 1 second, William looked less like the Prince of Wales and more like a son being told to stay in his place. Then he slid another document across the table. It was the continuity clause. You've already triggered it. Charles pushed the document back. Edward hasn't confirmed anything. William's expression changed. Barely, but enough. Hasn't he? The doors opened. Edward walked in with Anne behind him. No announcement. No ceremony. Edward carried the black dispatch case. Anne carried the Queen's old inventory book. Charles looked from one sibling to the other, then realized the decision had been made before they entered. Still, Edward didn't sit down. He placed the transfer documents on the table. Charles stood. We are not doing this like some hostile boardroom seizure. Edward met his eyes. You made the decision in a boardroom. We're correcting it in the same place. That was the moment Charles lost control of the meeting. Not the estate, the room. William opened the third envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper written by Queen Elizabeth in blue ink. The date at the top was 18 September 1997, less than 3 weeks after Diana's funeral. William read the first paragraph silently, then stopped. His jaw tightened. Anne looked away. Charles demanded that he continue. William handed the letter to Edward instead. That was strange. Charles noticed it immediately. Why won't you read it? William didn't answer. Edward did. Because the next part was written to you. Charles reached for the letter, but Edward held it firmly. Not yet. First, he read the opening words aloud. Gray Friars must never become compensation for affection, reward for loyalty, or shelter from difficult decisions. Nobody moved. The sentence didn't mention Camilla. It didn't mention Diana. It didn't name Charles. But everybody understood why it had been written in September 1997. The country was furious. The monarchy was shaken. William and Harry were grieving. Charles's private life had become a constitutional wound. Elizabeth had looked ahead and seen something nobody else in that room wanted to admit. One day, personal guilt might collide with inherited power. Gray Friars was her barrier against that day. And now, the barrier had activated. If you followed royal battles where one signature can detonate decades of buried resentment, subscribe, because the next line in the Queen's letter was the one Charles could not survive with his pride intact. Edward continued. My eldest son will believe that becoming sovereign gives him the right to repair every private sorrow, using whatever I leave behind. Charles's face changed. The anger vanished first, then the color. For years, he had waited to become king. Waited longer than any heir before him. He had watched decisions being delayed, duties being defined, and his private choices being judged through the shadow of his mother's reign. Now she was speaking from beyond the grave, not as queen, as his mother. And she had predicted him. Charles whispered, She wrote that about me? Edward lowered the page. Anne stepped forward, but Charles lifted one hand, not to silence her. To steady himself. William could have stopped there. He didn't. He asked the only question that still mattered. Why Gray Friars? Halden opened the inventory book to its final section. The answer was not land. It was what the land concealed. Inside the archive building were 218 private boxes, letters, diaries, photographs, records from the Queen's wartime childhood, correspondence with Philip, notes written during the abdication crisis by members of the family who had spoken to Elizabeth when she was still a child. But Box 218 was different. It had no contents listed, only a name. William. Charles stared at his son. William looked genuinely confused. Halden removed the brass key from the dispatch case and placed it between them. The same key William would be holding 47 minutes after the transfer. Queen Elizabeth had not merely protected an estate. She had built a sealed family archive, then placed its final unopened box under William's control. Why? Nobody knew. Not Halden. Not Anne. Not even Edward. Charles demanded the box be opened immediately. Halden refused. The instructions allowed it to be opened only inside Gray Friars, by William, after control had legally transferred. Charles laughed again, but this time there was no strength behind it. So my own mother left a secret for my son that I'm forbidden to see? William answered quietly. She may have left it about me, not for me. That possibility was worse. Because if the box contained letters about William's future, Diana's fears or decisions Elizabeth had made after the funeral, it could reshape everything Charles believed about those years. Charles turned toward Edward. "This is what you're approving?" Edward looked at the proposed trust one final time. Then he signed the confirmation. One stroke. That was all. William signed beneath him. The palace lawyer checked the time. 11:43 a.m. Control of Gray Friars passed immediately to the Prince of Wales in his role as a state protector. Charles was no longer permitted to transfer it. He could not change the beneficiaries. He could not authorize new residents. He could not enter the sealed archive without William's approval. That was when Charles reached for the papers. That was when Edward stopped him. That was when the king heard that he had no authority to reverse what had happened. But Charles wasn't looking at the deed anymore. He was looking at his mother's letter. "Give it to me," he said. Edward hesitated, then handed it over. Charles read the final paragraph alone. Nobody interrupted him. For nearly a minute, the only sound in the room came from the clock above the fireplace. Then Charles sat down. His shoulders folded. The letter slipped from his hand. William moved toward him, but Charles shook his head. Not angry, broken. Anne picked up the page. She read the last line silently, then passed it to William. The Queen had written, "If Charles mistakes this protection for rejection, tell him the estate was never withheld because I loved him too little. It was protected because I knew he would spend his life trying to repay love with sacrifice, even when the sacrifice was not his to make." That was the twist. Charles had not been exposed as greedy. He had been exposed as guilty. The Queen believed her son would keep giving things away to prove that the choices of his private life had been worth the damage they caused. Homes, access, security, legacy, perhaps even pieces of the inheritance she meant to survive them all. She had not blocked Charles to punish him. She had blocked him because she knew him. And that knowledge destroyed him more completely than any public humiliation could have. William looked at the transfer documents, then at his father. For the first time since entering the room, his voice softened. "I'm not taking it from you." Charles looked up. William closed his hand around the brass key. "I'm taking responsibility for the choice she knew you couldn't make." But even that wasn't the final blow. Because Edward turned over the Queen's letter and found one last instruction written across the back. A single sentence. William was not to become the permanent owner of Gray Friars. He was only its guardian. On the 30th birthday of Prince George, the estate would pass into an independent family trust. No monarch could sell it, no spouse could claim it, no heir could redirect it. The house, the land, and every sealed box would survive beyond Charles, beyond William, beyond George. The Queen hadn't chosen one man over another. She had removed the estate from the monarchy's emotional wars forever. By sunset, William was driven to Gray Friars. Charles did not go with him. Edward and Anne followed in a second car. At 6:18 p.m., William entered the stone archive alone. He walked past 217 numbered boxes before stopping at the final shelf, box 218. His name was written across it in his grandmother's hand. William inserted the brass key, but before turning it, he looked through the narrow window toward the driveway. Charles's car had arrived. The king stepped out alone. No equerry, no security visible, no crown. Just an aging son, holding his dead mother's letter, standing outside an estate she had taken from his control to protect him from himself. Tell me whether William honored the Queen's final wish or crossed a line no son should ever cross, because as his father waited outside, William turned the key and the lock finally opened.